Horror Nights presents 4 real scary hotel horror stories. Number 4. The Manhattan Axe Murders. On the afternoon of May 25, 1985, the police were called to a hotel room in New York City. When they entered the room, they found 85-year-old Janet Scott brutally murdered. She had been struck several times with either an axe or a hatchet. After killing the elderly woman, the killer collected some pieces of the skull and arranged them in a pattern that must have had some special significance to the killer. 5 days later, the killer struck again. 2 blocks away from where Janet Scott was killed, 58-year-old Ruth Podevin and her husband were staying at a hotel for a convention. When she didn't return to a luncheon after going to her room to change clothes, her husband went to see what the trouble was. He found their hotel room door ajar, and when he looked inside, he found his wife lying next to the bed. She had been struck 40 times with an axe-like weapon. Again, skull fragments were arranged in a pattern. Besides the pattern made from the skull fragments, both women were killed at noon, and both women were robbed. Since no murder weapon was found, the killer would have carried it to and from the hotels. The only clue is that a couple bought a Walkman with one of the victims' credit cards after the murders, but the couple has never been identified. The police were worried the axe murderer would strike again, but he or she never did, and no one has ever been arrested for the 2 murders. Number 3. The video behind the hotel wall. In July 1996, Ryan Lowe was demolishing an abandoned hotel just outside of Ketchum, Idaho. Behind some drywall, he found a VHS videotape. Thinking the video might have something interesting on it, he was able to sneak the videotape out to his truck. After work, he put the VHS tape in his VCR and sat down to watch it. He immediately knew why someone hid it. The video was recorded inside one of the hotel rooms, and in the frame was a young woman tied up to a chair. She was crying, and a man dressed like a baseball player walked into the frame of the camera. His face was covered in black paint, and he was wearing a white baseball hat. The uniform was white, and it reminded Lowe of an old Chicago White Sox uniform. The man then proceeded to beat the woman to death with the bat. It was deeply disturbing, and Lowe knew the murder was real. He had watched the Faces of Death videos and knew that it was hard to fake something like this. What he also saw was an opportunity to make some money. So he called up his friend, Jared Klein, who knew a lot about underground videos. Klein came over, and after watching the video, he concurred that the snuff film was real. They discussed it, and they thought they could probably sell the video for $10,000. Klein said that he would post a message on some strange internet forums he knew to see if he could find a buyer. The next day, Klein called Lowe and told him that he did have a buyer, and they were to meet in a motel room just outside of town at 7 p.m. When Lowe went to the hotel room, he was nervous, but brought the tape with him. Klein led him into the room, and when he did, Lowe was hit very hard on the back of the head, and he stumbled to the ground. Next, he felt zip ties go around his wrists, which tied his hands around his back, and then his ankles were tied up with zip ties as well. Klein then rolled out a plastic sheet and placed a chair in the middle of the sheet. Klein dragged Lowe to the chair and sat him up. As Lowe was being tied to the chair, he could see a video camera on a tripod in front of him. Klein said, "Sorry, man, but I realized if the buyer was willing to pay that much for one tape, I could sell 2 videos for double the price, if not more. Then I realized you live alone, you're single, and you're the only one that knows about the tape." He then put on a black leather mask and hit record on the camera. Lowe kept screaming for help even though he knew there was no one in the nearby rooms, and this was not the type of motel where you call 911, even if someone is screaming for help. Klein walked over to Lowe, waved at the camera, and then started to wrap duct tape around his friend's head. The last part he covered was his nose. Then he stepped back, but stayed in the frame and watched his friend suffocate to death. Afterwards, he drove the body out to a wooded area and buried Lowe in a shallow grave. Klein then posted an ad online that he was selling 2 snuff films for $30,000 and found someone who wanted them after a few days. Unfortunately for Klein, the buyer was actually an undercover cop. Klein was arrested for the murder of Lowe. The police went to the motel where Lowe was doing the demolition, and about 200 yards from the motel, cadaver dogs found the remains of 9 different people who went missing in the area between 1988 and 1993. The police believe that their murders were also recorded and possibly sold on the black market. Number 2. The mysterious death of Daniel Casolaro. On August 10, 1991, the cleaning staff of the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, made a horrifying discovery in room 517. In the bathtub was the body of 44-year-old freelance writer Daniel Casolaro. His wrists had been slashed 10 to 12 times. His death was immediately ruled a suicide, but his family strongly disagreed with that ruling. For one thing, Casolaro hated blood, so even if he did kill himself, he would not have done it in such a gruesome manner. Secondly, he told his family if he ended up dead and it looked like suicide, don't believe it, because he was murdered. His family said that Casolaro was in Martinsburg to meet with an informant on a mysterious story he was working on called The Octopus. The story was a conspiracy theory that revolved around a lawsuit called the Inslaw case. Inslaw was a tech company that was based in Washington, D.C. In the mid-1970s, they created a computer program for the Justice Department called the Prosecutor's Management Information System, or PROMIS for short. The purpose of the program was to track criminal cases around the world. Part of the deal that Inslaw made with the Justice Department was that they had to buy an updated version of PROMIS when it was released. However, they never did, and Inslaw sued, which led to a lengthy legal battle. When Casolaro started working on this octopus story, the Inslaw case had been in the court system for a decade. According to Casolaro's story, there was a computer engineer named Michael Riconoscuto who said that he was hired by the Justice Department to alter the code on PROMIS to create a backdoor in the program. This would allow the Justice Department to spy on anyone they sold the program to. Riconoscuto also said that he was involved in the Iran hostage crisis. He claimed that he and another man paid Iran $40 million on behalf of the Reagan administration to make sure the Iranians wouldn't release the hostages being held at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran until after the election. This delay would make President Jimmy Carter, who was seeking re-election, look weak, but it would benefit Reagan because he ran on the promise of being tough on Iran. The evidence was that 20 minutes after Reagan did his inaugural address on January 20, 1981, the hostages were released. Other parts of the conspiracy theory involved the Iran-Contra affair and the collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce, both of which happened under the Reagan administration. After his suicide, the boxes of notes that Casolaro had on the case went missing, and they've never been found. So was Casolaro's death a suicide, or was he killed because he got too close to the truth? Number 1. The Pact. In May 2012, 22-year-old Mark Dobson, his girlfriend, 32-year-old Mary Hepburn, and their friend, 52-year-old Helen Dorrington, met up in Barrie, Ontario, Canada. The trio met each other years before in a forum on the website The Joy of Satan, The reason they were meeting was to fulfill a suicide pact. The trio thought by killing themselves at dawn on the day after the Wiccan holiday of Beltane that they would be transported to a different planet where they would live glorious afterlives with Satan. On May 1st, the trio rented a hotel room and ordered chicken from a fast food restaurant. Just before dawn, the two women consumed some crushed pills, which was supposed to put them to sleep. Once they were asleep, then Dobson would strangle them and then kill himself. However, instead of putting them to sleep, the pills made them chatty. When Dobson started to strangle his girlfriend, she said to stop and that she was scared. Dobson didn't stop, though. Instead, he twisted her neck until he heard a snap. Yet she kept talking, and Dobson knew that she was past the point of no return. So he picked up a box cutter and started cutting her throat. Through one of the cuts, she gurgled out for him to stop. To quiet her, Dobson stuck his finger in the wound. He then moved on to Dorrington, and he slit her throat quickly. After killing the two women, Dobson dragged the box cutter across his neck and his wrists, but failed to kill himself. By now, hotel staff were alerted to the fact that something was wrong in the room. When they knocked on the door, Dobson let them in. The room was covered in blood. The two women were on the bed surrounded by dolls which were also covered in blood. Their throats had been cut so deeply that their heads were nearly severed. Dobson was taken to the hospital and ultimately survived his wounds. His lawyers argued that since he had schizophrenia, he couldn't be responsible for his actions. The judge, however, didn't buy it, and Dobson was sentenced to life in prison. Subscribe for more.